One morning, your neighbors are loyal subjects of the crown.
The next, they're rebels ready to die for an idea called freedom.
The American Revolution wasn't just a war against Britain, it was a war between friends, families, even beliefs.
Right, tearing communities apart.
And the shocking truth,
Yeah.
not everyone fighting for liberty agreed on what it meant.
That's a crucial point. The definition was contested.
This is The American Revolution by Eric Porterfield.
It's a really insightful account.
The untold story of how rebellion reshaped the world and the people brave or desperate enough to light the match.
Brave and desperate, I think that covers it.
Hello, everyone. Hi, all. I'm Emma.
And I'm John.
Welcome to Book Podcast Zone. Today, we are diving deep into Eric Porterfield's comprehensive 15-chapter history of the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's quite the undertaking, but Porterfield really digs into the human element, the psychology of it all.
Exactly. And we know you tasked us with synthesizing this massive historical work, moving from that irreversible first shot all the way through to the birth of the Constitution.
Right. Hitting the key moments, the big turning points.
And delivering the most impactful, human, and essential insights that, frankly, often get overlooked in standard textbooks. The stuff that makes you really feel the era.
Absolutely. The mission today isn't just to list battles and dates, is it?
No, not at all. It's to understand the profound strategic and, like you said, psychological shifts, Porterfield argues, really define this era.
Because this history, while dense, Porterfield's focus is crystal clear. To understand the revolution, you have to grasp what it meant for people to break trust.
Break trust with everything they knew. Their king, sometimes their family.
Yeah, all for a future they could only, imagine. An idea, really.
That's what makes this work so compelling, I think. Porterfield doesn't just chronicle troop movements, he's constantly probing that emotional core.
Making it clear that this was fundamentally a profound psychological and moral break for the people involved. A huge, huge gamble.
It wasn't some polite political debate happening across the Atlantic.
Not at all. It was raw. It was a civil war playing out in taverns, across fields, and even inside family homes. Brutal.
Okay, so let's get into it. Section 1 is about the start, the spark, and then the absolute depths of despair. Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 5. So let's begin with that point of no return. Chapter 1, the spark that lit the powder keg.
Right. Porterfield really zooms in on that single, unexpected shot in the darkness. Somewhere out in the Massachusetts countryside near Boston.
Lexington, Concord, that whole chaotic morning.
Exactly. That moment, maybe just one shot, maybe more, but the effect fundamentally transformed what was, I guess, a series of escalating protests.
Into an undeniable full-scale war. No going back.
But what's strategically critical about that first event, that single shot or the first volley, is its irreversible consequence. Porterfield hammers this home.
Yeah, because up until that point, like you said earlier, everything was theoretically repairable, right?
Theoretically. Colonial assemblies could draft petitions, London could repeal taxes, maybe new treaties could be negotiated. There were still channels, however strained.
But the second colonial blood was spilled by Crown forces.
The whole legal and political framework of protest just collapses. Poof! Porterfield calls it the sickening click of no turning back. A really evocative phrase.
It really is. It wasn't just a political shift. It was suddenly deeply societal, deeply personal.
And think about it. The simple act of remaining loyal to the crown, which is the default position just hours before, instantly transforms. It becomes an existential danger for those leaning towards rebellion.
And it forces this immediate, agonizing choice upon every single colonist, doesn't it? There's no more fence-sitting, really.
Not safely, anyway. It shifts the problem from being over there, the king and parliament in London, right into your community, maybe even your own house.
The sheer scale of that shift in consciousness, from being a subject of the king to suddenly being a potential combatant against him, it must have been overwhelming, mentally, emotionally.
Absolutely staggering. And that immediate pressure cooker environment, that's the focus of Chapter 2, Whispers in the Dark.
This is where Porterfield really shines, documenting that hidden conflict, the sort of shadow war, and the huge psychological toll it took in those early days.
Yeah, we're talking about the nitty-gritty of early espionage. How do they even communicate? Secret ink, codes.
Midnight rides, like Revere's, but probably countless others less famous, carrying messages at enormous personal risk.
And all this secrecy, this constant looking over your shoulder, it created an environment of intense suspicion throughout the colonies. Who could you actually trust?
I think the profound human cost Porterfield highlights is that ache of doubting someone you'd known your whole life, share drinks with them, work the field side by side.
The guy next to you in the hastily formed local militia, is he truly committed, or is he a loyalist informant just waiting, ready to turn you over for a bounty, maybe?
Or perhaps your own brother, your cousin, still secretly supports the crown and is just keeping quiet for now.
Porterfield captures this internal conflict beautifully. He makes it so clear the colonists weren't some unified bloc from day one. They were completely cleaved apart by this.
And the very system that helped them organize the resistance?
Like the committees of correspondence, right?
Yeah.
These networks were vital.
Exactly. They were crucial for spreading anti-crown sentiment, coordinating boycotts, mobilizing militia. But Porterfield shows how they simultaneously became tools of social control and suspicion.
Because they had to operate in total secrecy, which meant constantly vetting people, testing loyalties. It created this pervasive, gnawing suspicion everywhere. Group chat paranoia, 1775 edition, as Porterfield puts it, kind of cheekily.
Huh, that's good. But the stakes were life and death.
Absolutely. The act of rebellion wasn't just dangerous because of the redcoats. It was dangerous because your own neighbors were still agonizing over which side to choose, or actively choosing the other side.
And that psychological burden, living under the constant threat of being arrested, maybe executed for treason, that's what really elevates Porterfield's work beyond just a military history, isn't it?
Totally. It's about the internal war as much as the external one, the cost on the human spirit.
And just a quick reminder, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the source material, digging into Porterfield's perspective here,
Please do remember to like, subscribe, and maybe share this with someone else who might find it interesting. It really helps us keep these conversations going.
it does. Okay, thanks everyone. Let's get back to it. The pressure mounts.
So that sustained psychological tension, the internal division, the constant threat, it all eventually leads to the ultimate physical test for the nascent Continental Army.
Right. The winter encampment at Valley Forge. Porterfield dedicates 2 chapters to really unpack this. Chapter 3 focusing on the low point, and Chapter 5 on the rebirth.
Let's start with Chapter 3, Frostbite and Firelight. This documents the dire reality of that winter, 1777 into 78. No question, this was the absolute nadir of the war effort.
We often hear Valley Forge and think cold and hungry, but Porterfield really makes you feel the visceral experience, doesn't he?
He does. It's not abstract suffering. It's men lacking basic clothing, shirts, shoes, forced to wrap rags, old blankets, anything they could find around their freezing feet just to prevent frostbite.
And the starvation leading to them. I mean, it sounds apocryphal, but apparently true. Literally trying to cook and eat scraps of leather from their boots or belts.
Just unimaginable desperation. And the army wasn't just suffering from the elements or the rampant disease. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia were tearing through the camp.
It was structurally collapsing, wasn't it? Due to massive logistical failures, a Congress that was ineffective and underfunded.
And just vanishing hope. Morale was arguably lower than the temperature. The desperation is vividly captured in that historical anecdote Porterfield includes about Washington.
The story of him being seen praying alone in the snow.
Yeah. Whether it happened exactly like that or not, it symbolizes the utter fragility of the leadership and the entire revolutionary project at that moment. Washington wasn't holding the army together through brilliant victories at that point.
No, it seems like it was through sheer, visible, personal endurance, just refusing to quit, even when everything looked lost.
And the army was dissolving. Desertion rates were sky high. Sickness was claiming hundreds, maybe thousands. It was on the verge of just ceasing to exist.
Which makes the turnaround detailed in Chapter 5, Valley Forge, reborn in ice, even more incredible and necessary.
Absolutely necessary. This dramatic transformation is largely credited, as Porterfield explains, to the arrival of one key figure, the Prussian drill master, Baron von Steuben.
Ah, yes, von Steuben. He sounds like quite the character.
He was. A professional soldier, maybe exaggerating his noble title a bit, but he knew military discipline inside and out. He arrived to find what Porterfield accurately calls scarecrows, not an army.
And he just started drilling them. How did that work with the language barrier? He didn't speak much English, right?
Hardly any at first, which actually forced him to simplify things. He had to rely on translators like Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene, and he developed this very precise step-by-step system. He wrote a manual of arms, the famous Blue Book, that standardized every single movement.
Ah, so getting everyone on the same page, literally.
Yep.
Eliminating the confusion between militias from different colonies with different training.
Exactly. But it wasn't just marching. He revolutionized the entire camp layout, insisted on proper latrine placement, organized kitchens, improved sanitation overall, crucial administrative fixes.
That probably did as much to save the army as the drilling stopping the spread of disease.
Huge impact. So this wasn't just a quick glow-up montage like you see in movies. It was painstaking, grinding, organizational reconstruction, day after day in the cold.
But it proved that pain, that suffering, when properly directed and channeled into discipline, can forge something stronger. Legends, as Porterfield says.
Right. And the moment that really solidified this transformation, the psychological turning point, according to Porterfield, was the first perfect march.
When a whole company executed a complex drill maneuver flawlessly for the first time.
Yes. Imagine the scene. These men, who months before were starving, freezing, demoralized, now moving as one single disciplined unit. It wasn't just a military exercise.
It was proof. Proof to Washington, proof to the officers, but maybe most importantly, proof to the men themselves.
Exactly. Proof that they weren't just rebels anymore. They were soldiers. A professional, resilient, potentially unbreakable fighting force. That psychological boost was immense.
That whole transformation is really the core legacy of Valley Forge, isn't it? Beyond just the suffering.
It is. And, if you visit the Valley Forge National Historical Park in Pennsylvania today, it's quite moving. You can walk the grounds, see the rolling hills, the reconstructions of the simple log huts the soldiers built.
It helps you visualize that immense suffering, the scale of it. Thousands of men huddled there.
It really does. But it also helps you appreciate how that very suffering was channeled, transformed through sheer will and von Steuben's discipline into operational capability. They marched out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, a fundamentally different army. More resilient, more confident, and much, much more dangerous to the British.
A crucible, in the truest sense of the word.
But even with that rebirth at Valley Forge, the psychological war, the internal strains, they didn't just vanish. Which brings us right back to Chapter 4.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The name that broke us. We have to talk about Benedict Arnold.
We do. Porterfield argues this was arguably the deepest emotional gut punch of the entire revolution for the American side.
Because Arnold wasn't just some minor officer. He was a genuine hero, wasn't he?
Wow.
Celebrated.
Absolutely. He was incredibly brave, maybe even reckless, wounded seriously at Quebec, and again at Saratoga battles where he played a major role. He led some of the most daring early campaigns like the March Through the Maine Wilderness. He really embodied that tenacious, never-say-die fighting spirit of the early revolution.
So for him to go from that, this celebrated figure, a man who had literally bled for the cause,
To a traitor, overnight, planning to hand over the critical fort at West Point to the British, it created this profound shockwave of distrust and, frankly, despair. Porterfield forces us to really stare at that fall from grace.
What does Porterfield suggest about his motives? Was it really just about the money and maybe bitterness over being passed over for promotion, or was there something deeper?
Porterfield suggests it was a complex mix. Yes, money was a huge factor. Arnold lived extravagantly and was deeply in debt. And yes, perceived slights from Congress played a massive role. He felt constantly overlooked, underappreciated, maybe even persecuted compared to his peers. He had powerful enemies in Congress.
So ego and resentment were definitely there.
Big time. But Porterfield also hints at a growing psychological fatigue, maybe a genuine disillusionment with the whole revolutionary project. He saw the infighting, the incompetence within Congress, felt personally targeted by political maneuvering.
And perhaps convinced himself that his own glory, his talents, would be better recognized and utilized on the British side, where there was structure and money.
Possibly. It's hard to know for sure. But the impact was devastating. His celebrated identity was instantly erased, replaced with this symbol of absolute infamy. Traitor became his first name, essentially.
And it must have validated all those fears and paranoia we talked about earlier from Chapter 2.
Exactly. If a hero like Arnold could turn his coat, then who could you really trust? It wasn't just a strategic blow, though losing West Point would have been catastrophic. It was a massive psychological blow.
The damage to morale, especially coming not that long after the Army had rebuilt itself at Valley Forge, must have been immense, almost as damaging as losing a battle.
Porterfield argues it was in some ways. It threatened the very foundation of trust within the leadership structure, at a time when trust was already fragile.
But just as these shadows of treason and potential collapse loomed, Washington again recognized the critical need for a boost. A massive, symbolic victory to counter the gloom.
Which leads us directly to Chapter 6, The River Runs Red, Trenton, Christmas night, 1776.
Okay, wait. Trenton was before Valley Forge and Arnold's treason, right? The timeline here seems a bit jumped.
You're absolutely right. My mistake. Good catch. The outline grouped Arnold, Chapter 4, with Trenton, Chapter 6, thematically, perhaps contrasting betrayal with a comeback, but chronologically, yes, Trenton was much earlier, December 1776. Valley Forge was the winter of 77-78, and Arnold's treason attempt was 1780. Let's correct that.
Okay, so backing up chronologically to late 1776. The situation was dire then, too, wasn't it, after losses in New York?
Extremely dire. The army had been pushed out of New York City, chased across New Jersey. Morale was collapsing. Critically, as Porterfield emphasizes, the enlistment contracts for a huge portion of the Continental Army were set to expire right at the end of the year, December 31st.
So the army was literally about to dissolve anyway.
Pretty much. If Washington did nothing, if there wasn't some reason for these men to re-enlist or for new recruits to join, the Continental Army could simply cease to exist in a matter of days. So Trenton wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about sheer political and military survival.
And Washington's response was this incredibly desperate, high-risk, almost impossible gamble.
Crossing the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, in a blizzard, to launch a surprise attack. It sounds like something out of fiction.
Porterfield really captures the tension of that crossing, doesn't he? Not just worrying about the enemy, but the immediate physical danger from the river itself. The ice, the freezing cold.
Absolutely. The boat struggling, men falling in, the sheer misery of it all. They then had to march several miles through driving snow and sleet, many poorly shod or even barefoot.
To surprise the Hessian garrison stationed in Trenton, who were presumably, enjoying the holiday.
Reports vary on how much celebrating they were doing, but they certainly weren't expecting an attack in those conditions. The tactical brilliance lay in achieving total surprise and the speed of the assault. Washington divided his forces to attack from multiple directions.
And the result was a stunning success.
A huge success. They captured nearly 1,000 Hessian mercenaries with very few American casualties. It was a massive tactical victory, but the strategic and psychological impact was even greater.
That emotional peak Porterfield describes the roar of victory when the impossible actually works. When these American troops who had endured months of defeat and retreat and misery finally achieved a decisive win.
It was the ultimate underdog comeback. A desperately needed morale boost right before those enlistments expired. It gave people, soldiers, civilians, Congress a reason to believe again. It provided the political oxygen needed to keep the fight alive through that brutal winter and encourage re-enlistment.
And when you think about the historical sites today, like Washington Crossing Historic Park, spanning both Pennsylvania and New Jersey.
Yeah, you're looking at the very spot where the revolution was arguably snatched back from the brink of total collapse. That one desperate gamble changed everything. It demonstrated Washington's leadership and audacity. Hashtag 2.2 global recognition and Southern brutality. Chapter 7, 8, 9.
Okay, so Trenton provides that crucial lifeline in late 76. But the war is far from over. What was the next major turning point, according to Porterfield?
That would be the victory at Saratoga, New York in the fall of 1777. Porterfield covers this in Chapter 7, aptly titled Saratoga, The Turn.
Why was Saratoga such a big deal? Wasn't it more of a conventional battle?
It was, and that was partly the point. It proved the Continental Army, with militia support, could actually stand up to and defeat a large, professional British regular army in a major campaign, not just a quick raid like Trenton.
What was the British plan there?
Overly ambitious and poorly coordinated, as it turned out. The idea was for General John Burgoyne to march south from Canada down the Hudson River Valley. He was supposed to link up with another British force coming east from Lake Ontario under Barry St. Leger, and ideally coordinate with General William Howe's main army moving north from New York City. A classic pincer movement to cut off New England.
Sounds good on paper, I guess. What went wrong?
The several things. St. Leger's force got checked by American militia and Native American allies at Fort Stanwix and had to retreat. And crucially, General Howe decided to capture Philadelphia instead of heading north to support Burgoyne. Communication was slow, egos were involved.
Leaving Burgoyne high and dry.
Exactly. Isolated deep in upstate New York, his supply lines stretched thin, facing growing numbers of American Continentals under General Horatio Gates and skilled militia who were masters of forest fighting. After a couple of sharp battles, the Americans surrounded Burgoyne's army.
And forced his surrender. The whole army.
The entire army. Thousands of British and Hessian soldiers. Porterfield paints a vivid picture. The victory painted in blood and brilliant autumn leaves, followed by the almost stunned silence of the formal British surrender. It was a massive, undeniable military catastrophe for the British.
But the biggest consequence wasn't just military, was it?
No, that's the key. Saratoga wasn't just a battlefield win, it was the critical diplomatic plot twist. It was the proof that France needed.
Proof that the American rebellion wasn't just a lost cause.
Precisely. The European powers, especially France, had been watching closely, secretly supplying some aid, but they were hesitant to openly commit to what looked like a failing rebellion. Saratoga provided the hard military evidence that the Americans could win major victories against British regulars. It showed they were a viable ally.
And that directly led to the French alliance.
Directly. Benjamin Franklin had been working tirelessly in Paris, charming the French court. Saratoga gave him the leverage he needed. It paved the way for the Treaty of Alliance in early 1778, formal French recognition of the United States, and critically, the commitment of French military and naval power.
Which inevitably complicates everything, Chapter 8, Allies and Agendas.
Right. Suddenly, liberty had a messy, multinational price tag attached. Once France officially ended the war, and later Spain joined as an ally of France, though not formally allied with the U.S.
It wasn't just Americans versus the British anymore.
No. Now you have French ships on the seas, French troops arriving, Spanish gold funding parts of the effort, Dutch loans, but also competing colonial egos and national interests, all clashing in what became a truly global conflict.
How crucial was that alliance, really? Could the Americans have won without France?
Porterfield argues, and most historians agree, probably not. The French Navy was absolutely essential in challenging British control of the seas, which ultimately led to Yorktown. French financial support, weapons, and experienced troops were also vital. The U.S. was essentially bankrupt.
But it came with strings attached, international collab drama, as Porterfield puts it.
Definitely. French and Spanish agendas often diverged significantly from purely American interests. France's primary goal was to weaken its arch-rival, Britain, globally. They wanted to regain lost prestige and territory, particularly valuable sugar islands in the Caribbean.
And Spain.
Spain was focused on its own strategic interests, regaining Florida from Britain, securing territories along the Gulf Coast like Pensacola, and hoping to eventually get Gibraltar back from the British. They were wary of American expansionism.
So the war transforms from this, localized rebellion focused on North America
into a sprawling global conflict. Britain suddenly found itself stretched incredibly thin, fighting not just in America, but in the Caribbean, off the coast of Africa, in India, even defending against potential invasion at home.
Which ultimately helped the American cause, right? By diverting Britain's resources.
Massively. It forced Britain to make difficult choices about where to prioritize its forces. But on the ground, it often led to frustration. American leaders sometimes felt their allies were prioritizing their own global chess match over the immediate needs of the war in America. Washington constantly pleaded for more naval support at specific times and places.
So it was this kind of awkward, sometimes tense, but ultimately necessary handshake that saved the nation, managing these wildly divergent strategic goals.
That's a good way to put it. Complex diplomacy, navigating national pride and competing objectives, was suddenly just as important as battlefield tactics.
And as the war becomes more global, and after the stalemate around Philadelphia and New York following Saratoga and Valley Forge, the main focus of the fighting shifts, doesn't it?
It does. The British adopted a southern strategy, believing there was more loyalist support in the South, and hoping to roll up the colonies from Georgia northward. This leads us into the period covered in Chapter 9, the Southern Inferno.
Inferno sounds about right. Porterfield describes this phase as particularly brutal.
Extremely brutal. The war dragged into the swamps and pine forests of the Carolinas and Georgia. It was characterized less by large set-piece battles, though there were some, like Camden and Cowpens, and more by vicious partisan warfare, guerrilla tactics, and intense loyalist-patriot clashes.
This is where figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, become legendary.
Exactly. Marion, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, Andrew Pickens. These leaders used their knowledge of the local terrain, the swamps and rivers, to wage relentless harassment campaigns against British supply lines and outposts. Porterfield calls them guerrilla ghosts, striking quickly, disrupting communications, tying down significant numbers of British troops, and then melting back into the landscape.
But it wasn't just militia versus redcoats, was it? It was neighbor against neighbor.
That's what made it so ugly. It was a true civil war in the South. Loyalists actively fought alongside the British, leading to cycles of raid and reprisal, barn burnings, even massacres on both sides. It tore communities and families apart in a way that was perhaps even more intense than in the North.
And this brought profound moral dilemmas for ordinary civilians caught in the middle.
Absolutely. Porterfield really highlights the impossible choices facing, say, a small farmer. The British Army marches through. Do you provide them supplies, willingly or unwillingly? Then the Patriot militia comes back. Do they accuse you of collaboration?
Or the choice Porterfield mentions. Do you torch your own fields, destroy your own livelihood using scorched earth tactics just to deny resources to the enemy?
Imagine having to make that calculation. Burn your own crops, kill your own livestock, hoping it helps the cause, or risk being seen as aiding the enemy and facing retribution, possibly losing your life or your soul, as Porterfield puts it.
It highlights the sheer, desperate endurance required just to survive, let alone maintain the rebellion in the South during those years. The depth of commitment must have been incredible, even amidst that chaos and personal ruin.
It really underscores how much of a civil war the Revolution was, especially in its later stages. It wasn't just a clean fight against a foreign power. It was deeply entangled with local loyalties, resentments, and brutal choices.
Okay, so the war in the South is this brutal, grinding affair. But within that, we start seeing the American forces, particularly the Continentals under leaders like Nathaniel Greene, becoming much more strategically adept.
Definitely. Which brings us to Chapter 10, Cowpens, the trap snapped shut. Porterfield presents this as a victory not just of grit, but of genuine tactical mastery.
Cowpens, South Carolina, January 1781. What made this battle so brilliant?
It was arguably the most strategically sophisticated American victory of the entire war, orchestrated by General Daniel Morgan. He wasn't just fighting, he was thinking several steps ahead, using psychology as much as muskets.
Against whom?
Against the aggressive, perhaps overconfident, British Legion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, notorious for his ruthlessness, by the way.
So how did Morgan set the trap?
He chose his ground carefully, backing his men up near a river to discourage retreat. Then he deployed his forces in 3 distinct lines. Critically, he put his less reliable militia, who the British often disdained, right out front.
That sounds risky.
It was. But here's the genius. Morgan gave them explicit instructions. Fire just 2 volleys at the charging British, inflict some casualties, and then retreat, run back behind the man line of experienced Continentals. He basically weaponized the militia's known tendency to break under pressure.
So he used their weakness as bait.
Exactly. Tarleton, seeing the militia break as expected, ordered his men to charge forward eagerly. Thinking they had the Americans on the run, they rushed headlong, becoming disorganized.
Right into the trap.
Right into the steady, disciplined fire of Morgan's veteran Continentals, who were waiting calmly behind a ridge. After delivering devastating volleys, Morgan ordered a coordinated bayonet charge while his cavalry, hidden until the right moment, swung around and hit the British flank. A classic double envelopment.
Wow. A feigned retreat leading to a counterpunch and encirclement. That's
Yeah.
complex.
It was tactical poetry, a layered defense using terrain, psychology, and precise timing. It completely routed Tarleton's elite force, inflicting massive casualties and capturing most of his infantry. Porterfield frames it as the chess move that really checkmates the British Southern strategy.
And proof that the American army could now win decisively through superior generalship and maneuvering, not just by outlasting the enemy.
Absolutely. It was a huge boost to American morale after some tough losses in the South, and a devastating blow to British prestige and manpower in the region. It demonstrated the maturation of American military leadership.
This strategic brilliance at Cowpens really sets the stage for the final act, doesn't it? Chapter 11, Yorktown. The world turned upside down.
It does. Yorktown, Virginia, in the fall of 1781. This is the ultimate mic drop moment of the military campaign. The culmination of everything: the American endurance, the tactical learning, and, crucially, that French alliance.
What led the British Army under General Cornwallis to Yorktown?
After campaigning through the Carolinas, including the costly, though technically British, victory at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis decided to move his army north into Virginia, hoping to cut off supplies and eventually link up with British naval forces for resupply or evacuation. He chose Yorktown, a port town on a peninsula.
Which turned out to be a strategic blunder.
A fatal one. Washington, coordinating closely with the French General Rochambeau, whose army had marched south from Rhode Island, saw the opportunity. They rapidly moved their combined Franco-American forces south to trap Cornwallis on land.
But the key was the sea, right? Cornwallis was counting on the British Navy.
Absolutely critical. And this is where the French alliance paid its biggest dividend. The French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, sailed up from the Caribbean and decisively engaged and defeated the British naval squadron sent to relieve Cornwallis at the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes.
So de Grasse sealed off the escape route by sea.
Completely. Total naval superiority. Cornwallis was trapped. hemmed in on the peninsula by the combined land armies and blocked from the sea by the French fleet.
And the siege began?
A classic, large-scale European-style siege. The Franco-American forces dug systematic siege lines, trenches getting progressively closer to the British defenses, and unleashed a relentless artillery bombardment day and night. Porterfield really stages this as the revolution's inevitable, dramatic final act.
And the emotional climax?
The sheer, almost stunned joy Porterfield describes when the British finally requested terms for surrender. The feeling of, we actually won after 6 long, brutal years.
And the famous story of the British band playing "The World Turned Upside Down" during the surrender ceremony.
Whether that specific tune was played is debated by some historians, but the sentiment was absolutely real. The surrender of an entire British army, led by a top general, to this rebel force and their French allies, it truly felt like the established order of the world had been overturned. This moment in October 1781 effectively ended major combat operations in North America.
But the war wasn't officially over yet.
Not officially. Which brings us to the often overlooked Chapter 12, The Long Goodbye. The fighting mostly stops, but the peace process is arduous.
Right. The immediate roar of victory at Yorktown fades pretty quickly into something else.
Into quiet exhaustion, uncertainty, and simmering tension. Peace negotiations dragged on for nearly 2 years in Paris between American diplomats like Franklin, Adams, Jay, and the British. There were complex issues to resolve: boundaries, treatment of loyalists, fishing rights.
And critically, what about the American soldiers, the ones who had actually won the war?
That's the painful focus of this chapter. They waited. Unpaid, far from home, watching Congress struggle under the weak Articles of Confederation, seemingly unable or unwilling to fulfill its promises. Porterfield lingers on this difficult aftermath.
He calls it the hollow ache of surviving victory. That's powerful.
It is, because the challenge these veterans faced was immense. They had secured liberty on the battlefield, but they returned, or waited to return, often to ruined farms, massive personal debt, and a government that couldn't even pay them the wages they were owed.
The demobilization blues, as Porterfield terms it, before PTSD or veteran support systems even existed as concepts.
Exactly. And this wasn't just personal hardship. It created a profound political crisis that very nearly tore the new nation apart before it could even properly begin.
You mean the Newburgh Conspiracy?
Precisely. In early 1783, at the Army's winter camp in Newburgh, New York, deep frustration among the officers over the lack of pay and pensions boiled over. Anonymous letters circulated, urging the officers to potentially refuse to disband or even to march on Congress to demand what they were owed by force.
A military coup.
Just as the war was ending. It was a real possibility. The situation was incredibly tense. It took the immense personal prestige and moral authority of George Washington himself to defuse it.
How did he do that?
He called a meeting of the officers. He gave a moving speech, appealing to their patriotism and sense of honor. Famously, he fumbled for his glasses, remarking that he had not only grown gray, but now found himself growing blind in the service of his country. That very human, vulnerable moment reportedly moved many officers to tears and broke the tension.
Wow. So he calmed the unrest and prevented the army from potentially seizing power.
He did, but the entire Newburgh crisis starkly highlighted the immediate political vacuum and the dangerous instability facing the new country under the Articles of Confederation. It forms a critical, urgent bridge from the military victory to the immense challenge of actually governing the nation they had just created. The war was won, but could the peace survive? Hashtag tag 3.2, Forging a Government, chapters 13, 14, 15.
Okay, so the military victory is secured, but as Chapter 12 shows, it immediately dissolves into political urgency. The very soldiers who won the peace return home to find a country on the brink of domestic anarchy, largely because the government couldn't function.
Precisely. Which leads directly into Chapter 13, A New Constellation. The gathering in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention.
And the immediate backdrop, as you mentioned, was the disastrous failure of the first attempt at national governance, the Articles of Confederation. What exactly was failing so badly? Why couldn't they just tweak the Articles?
Porterfield argues the problems were fundamental. The Articles, drafted during the war out of intense fear of replicating British centralized tyranny, intentionally created an extremely weak central government, maybe too weak.
How so? What couldn't it do?
Critically, the Confederation Congress had no power to levy taxes directly on the people. It could only request funds from the states, and the states often ignored those requests or paid only a fraction.
So no money to pay soldiers, run the government, pay off war debts.
Exactly. Crippling national debt. It also couldn't regulate interstate commerce selectively, leading to trade wars between the states, each acting like a mini-nation with its own tariffs and interests.
And currency issues too, right? Different states printing their own money.
Total chaos. Inflation was rampant in some areas. There was no uniform economic policy. Plus, the articles required unanimous consent from all 13 states to make any significant amendments, which was practically impossible. The government was paralyzed.
And the final wake-up call, the event that really terrified the elites and spurred the call for the Philadelphia Convention.
That was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786-87, an armed uprising of indebted farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, protesting high state taxes, foreclosures, and rigid government policies that favored creditors.
So the very people who fought for liberty were now taking up arms against their own new government.
That was the horrifying irony. The state militia eventually suppressed the rebellion, but it sent shockwaves through the country. It demonstrated the potential for widespread disorder and the inability of the Article's government to maintain domestic peace or address legitimate grievances effectively.
This intense anxiety that the freedom they had just won might immediately fracture into chaos or civil war, that's what drove the delegates to Philadelphia.
Absolutely. They gathered initially just to revise the articles, but many key figures like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton quickly realized that a complete overhaul was necessary. They knew they had to create something entirely new.
A form of government capable of ensuring national stability, economic prosperity, and defense, but without installing a new king or replicating the centralized power they had just overthrown. A huge challenge.
A monumental challenge. And Porterfield frames this period brilliantly as the startup nation beta version. They weren't just tweaking laws, they were inventing a new form of government, a large-scale republic based on Enlightenment ideas but also on brutal, practical compromises hammered out through intense argument in that hot Philadelphia summer.
And the core of that argument, the biggest initial hurdle, was representation, wasn't it? Large states versus small states.
That was the first major sticking point that nearly blew up the convention. You had the Virginia Plan, proposed by Madison, which favored large states by suggesting representation in both houses of Congress be based on population.
Which the small states like Delaware and New Jersey strongly opposed.
Naturally. They countered with the New Jersey Plan, which proposed keeping a single legislative body where each state had one vote, similar to the Articles, ensuring equal power for all states regardless of size. The debate became incredibly fierce.
Until they reached the Great Compromise.
Right. Also known as the Connecticut Compromise, largely brokered by Roger Sherman. This was the breakthrough. Create a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives would have representation based on state population, satisfying the large states.
They're in the Senate.
The Senate would have equal representation, 2 senators per state, regardless of size, satisfying the small states.
Yeah.
A balance between representing the people directly and representing the states as entities.
A crucial compromise. But as Porterfield points out, it wasn't the only morally fraught compromise needed to keep the fragile union together, was it?
Not by a long shot. The ugly debate over slavery loomed large. How should slaves be counted, if at all, when determining a state's population for representation in the House and for taxation purposes?
Leading to the infamous 3/5 compromise.
Yes. A deeply contentious agreement where Southern delegates insisted slaves be counted fully for representation, boosting their power in Congress, but not for taxation, while Northern delegates argued the opposite, or that slaves shouldn't be counted at all as they were treated as property. The compromise was that 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted for both representation and direct taxation purposes.
A compromise built on dehumanization, essentially kicking the can down the road on the fundamental contradiction of slavery in a nation supposedly founded on liberty.
Absolutely. It was a raw political deal made to secure Southern states' agreement to the Constitution. But it embedded that contradiction right into the nation's founding document, with tragic long-term consequences. There were other compromises, too, on regulating commerce, on the election and powers of the president. It was a whole summer of negotiation and trade-offs.
And even after they finally hammered out this new constitution, getting it ratified by the states was another huge battle, right? Which brings us to Chapter 14, the Bill of Rights, Ink, and Compromise.
It's exactly. The draft constitution went out to the states for ratification, and it immediately faced massive opposition from a group who became known as the Anti-Federalists.
Who were they? Figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason.
Yes, prominent patriots, governors, ordinary farmers, a diverse coalition who feared that the powerful new central government created by the Constitution was too powerful. that it lacked specific, explicit protections for individual liberties and could potentially become just as tyrannical as the British monarchy they had fought against.
Their main argument was the lack of a Bill of Rights.
That was their most potent and popular argument. They pointed out that many state constitutions had bills of rights, but the proposed federal constitution did not explicitly guarantee freedoms like speech, press, religion, or protection against unreasonable searches. They demanded amendments to safeguard these rights before ratification.
And the Federalists, the proponents of the Constitution like Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, initially resisted adding a Bill of Rights.
Some did, arguing it was unnecessary because the Constitution created a government of limited enumerated powers, meaning it could only do what was explicitly listed, and therefore couldn't infringe on rights not mentioned. Others worried that trying to list rights would be dangerous, implying that any rights not listed weren't protected.
But the political reality was that ratification was failing in key states without the promise of amendments.
Exactly. The opposition was strong enough, particularly in large states like Virginia and New York, that the Constitution likely would not have been ratified without the Federalists eventually agreeing to consider amendments immediately after the new government was formed.
So the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was essentially this deal that saved the dream, as Porterfield puts it.
That's a perfect way to capture it. James Madison, initially skeptical, became the main architect of the Bill of Rights in the First Congress. It was designed explicitly to calm the fears of the anti-Federalists, to provide those concrete safeguards for fundamental individual freedoms against potential federal government overreach.
Freedom of speech, press, religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, right to a fair trial. The core rights we often think of today.
Those very rights. Porterfield refers to the Bill of Rights metaphorically as the essential patch notes for a newborn country, a critical update.
I like that. It acknowledged that the original framework, while maybe necessary for stability and national survival, felt incomplete or even dangerous to a large segment of the population who had just fought a revolution against perceived tyranny.
Right. It provided those necessary reassurances, those explicit limitations on government power, paving the way for the final ratification by holdout states like North Carolina and Rhode Island, and giving the new Constitution greater legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The Constitution provided the structure, the engine of government. The Bill of Rights provided the brakes and the steering wheel, protecting the individual.
A structure and a promise finally in place. Which brings us to the conclusion, Chapter 15, Echoes in the Silence.
Yes. The fighting is long over. The foundational documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, are signed, ratified, and the new government under President Washington is underway. But Porterfield argues the fight isn't truly over.
What does he mean? The fight for the soul of the revolution.
Exactly. The fight over what those ideals of liberty and equality actually mean in practice, who they apply to, and how to balance individual freedom with collective security and order, that struggle begins immediately.
Porterfield closes his history not with a triumphant bang, but more with a quiet, lingering question, doesn't he?
He does. The victory is secured on paper, the government structure is established, but the most important and perhaps perpetual work remains. The constant, ongoing process of trying to actually live up to the lofty ideals they inscribed, ideals that were already compromised in the founding documents themselves.
The silence after the revolution, Porterfield suggests, was an emptiness. It was filled with the echoes of those unfulfilled promises, those difficult compromises, especially regarding slavery and equality that would continue to shape and often divide the country's trajectory for centuries to come. It's a very thought-provoking end. #outro. Okay, so let's try to quickly pull together the threads of this comprehensive blueprint Porterfield has laid out for us. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started with that initial irreversible psychological break in Boston, the sickening click, as Porterfield called it, and the pervasive paranoia that immediately gripped the colonies, as detailed in Chapter 2.
Then we move through the absolute depths of despair, but also the crucial structural rebirth at Valley Forge, proving the Continental Army could endure and professionalize against all odds.
We confronted the devastating emotional gut punch of Benedict Arnold's treason, a stark reminder of the internal fragility and the stakes involved, testing the nation's trust to its core.
Followed chronologically, much earlier, of course, by the desperate gamble and essential spiritual resurrection achieved at Trenton, snatching survival from the jaws of defeat.
Then came the major strategic turning points. Saratoga, the conventional victory that secured the absolutely vital French alliance, transforming the conflict into a global war.
And cowpens down south, showcasing brilliant American tactical maturity with Morgan's flawless trap, the checkmate move that crippled the British Southern strategy.
All leading inevitably to the final decisive siege at Yorktown, the culmination of Franco-American cooperation, where the world turned upside down and the military victory was effectively sealed.
But maybe most importantly, Porterfield takes us beyond the battlefield, into that tense long goodbye with the unpaid army, highlighting the failures of the Articles.
Which forced the issue, leading to Philadelphia in 1787. That anxious, difficult, intensely argued process of forging a government, converting rebellion into stability through the structural complexity and compromises of the Constitution.
And finally, cementing it, at least politically, with the essential promise of individual liberties contained in the Bill of Rights, the patch notes needed to get the whole system ratified and running.
It's a huge arc, from a single shot to a functioning, if flawed, constitutional republic.
And that brings us back, John, to Porterfield's central, haunting question from Chapter 15, that echo in the silence. Did we live up to it?
That really is the lasting complexity Porterfield leaves us with, isn't it? If we truly view the American Revolution, as he encourages us to, as this fundamental, radical political experiment,
A deliberate breaking away from monarchy to pursue self-governance based on Enlightenment ideals.
then we absolutely have to confront the fact that the original compromises made in 1787, particularly the deep economic divisions, the initial failure to clearly define citizenship or address the status of women and Native Americans, and most profoundly, the political and moral acceptance of chattel slavery. These compromises still reverberate. Echoes isn't the half of it.
Those initial structural flaws, those ambiguities and contradictions baked into the founding, they continue to influence and shape current political debates, social inequalities, and cultural conflicts to this very day, don't they?
Without a doubt. So if the country really was a startup nation, beta version, back in 1787, constantly needing updates and fixes through crisis, amendment, and interpretation.
And then the provocative question Porterfield leaves for you, the listener, is this. What stage is that experiment in now, nearly 250 years later?
Is the American Revolution best understood not as a finished event in the past, but as maybe a 250-year software update still in progress? A continuous, often painful struggle to debug the original code, address the initial compromises, and finally fully live up to those revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality for all its inhabitants.
That's the conversation Porterfield implies that never truly ends. A powerful thought to end on.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much for sharing Eric Porterfield's detailed source material and for joining us for this very deep dive into the revolution unfolded. It was fascinating to unpack.
My pleasure. It's a history that always bears revisiting.
We'll catch you next time on Book Podcast Zone.